Welcome to What Happened to Nelson Mandela's South Africa, a special series we're doing on The Conversation Weekly, marking 30 years of post-apartheid South Africa.
I address you after weeks of speculation about my future.
It's 2018, and South Africa's democracy is reeling from two tumultuous terms of President Jacob Zuma. When Zuma resigns, the country is left with big economic challenges and a series of corruption scandals. South Africa is at a crossroads, and up steps Cyril Ramaphosa.
I thank you for the honor that you bestow on me by electing me to this position.
In this series, we're exploring what has happened to Nelson Mandela's South Africa as the country celebrates 3 decades of post-apartheid democracy. I'm Gemma Ware, host of The Conversation Weekly, and I'm joined for this final episode of our series by my colleague Thabo Leshilo, Politics and Society Editor at The Conversation, based in Johannesburg, South Africa. Welcome back, Thabo.
Hello, Gemma.
Thabo, in this final episode, we're going to be taking South Africa up to the present day and reflecting as well on what Nelson Mandela and his legacy means for young South Africans today, many of whom are actually called this born-free generation who never lived under apartheid. But let's go back a few years to when Zuma resigned. Paint a picture for our listeners, if you would, of what the situation was like immediately after that moment.
Yeah, sure. After Zuma's resignation, South Africa was grappling with widespread corruption allegations and state capture, which had eroded public trust and damaged the credibility of public institutions. Secondly, the country had a high unemployment rate and sluggish growth. And then there was turmoil within the ANC, with factions vying for control and ideological divisions becoming more and more visible.
So all these factions, the divisions between the different parts of the ANC, what was actually happening to it and its popularity in the country at that point?
Confidence in the ANC, which has been a dominant force in South African politics since the end of apartheid, has plummeted massively. The expectation was clear. South Africa needed someone radically different to assume the presidency and steer the country out of the crisis.
So with this backdrop of uncertainty and public discontent, Cyril Ramaphosa emerged as the next president of South Africa. Tell us about him and the role he played in South Africa's history to this point.
Yeah, Cyril Ramaphosa was actually a trade unionist. He played a pivotal role in negotiations of this new constitution, and everybody expected him to actually be the successor to Nelson Mandela. But that wasn't to be. What actually eventually happened was that Sithembile Mbete became the successor, and Cyril Ramaphosa went into business. And then, he was in business for a couple of decades and re-emerged later as a deputy president of the African National Congress, as a deputy to Jacob Zuma, and eventually the leader of the African National Congress and the president of the country.
So he's got a big standing in the history of the liberation struggle, politics and business in the country. What was the task ahead of him when he took over in 2018?
He had a mammoth task on his hands. I mean, it was a time for cleaning up. He had a lot of cleaning up to do. And to get a better understanding of this critical period in South Africa's history, I reached out to Richard Calland. He's associate professor in public law at the University of Cape Town, and he wrote a book about South Africa's post-apartheid heads of state, titled The Presidents from Mandela to Ramaphosa, Leadership in the Age of Crisis. Richard grew up in the UK, and he told me how he arrived in South Africa and began studying the country's politics.
As the 80s went on, I, like anyone who was interested in progressive politics in Britain, I got involved in the anti-apartheid movement. And then I remember through my work with the Labour Party becoming aware of a scheme of Labour activists and experienced Labour Party election people being lent to the ANC for the 94 election. And so I came over in February 1994 in order to contribute on an entirely voluntary basis to the ANC's campaign here in Western Cape, where I live now. I arrived when the country was on a knife edge, and then I had the extraordinary experience of witnessing that first democratic election from first hand, and it was life-changing.
Richard, you've been studying the leadership style of South Africa's post-apartheid presidents, and of course, you wrote a book on it. Have you identified any significant shifts and changes in the last 3 decades?
What's so interesting about modern South Africa is that for the 30 years since 1994, The ANC is dominated. We're coming to the end of that period of domination by the ANC now. We're into a period of what I call the second transition. But what's interesting is that despite the electoral dominance of the ANC, we've had leaders of very different character. Mandela, the statesman, the unifier, the person who wanted to put, in a sense, unity ahead of anything else, and to give, in particular, white people a chance to repay what they had gained unfairly, cruelly during apartheid. We had Mbeki, who was the prime minister, who wanted to, in a technical way, build the capacity of the state, and who was willing to make strategic choices around how to run the economy, even if they cost him political capital. In the end, perhaps his cleverness was his downfall. He lost touch with people, particularly in his own party. And Zuma, who is a very different character, chalk to Mbeki's cheese, came in. He's a great communicator. He can really sell himself, as we now know. Very different character. McClanty was the calm, measured elder statesman between those two leaders, and many of us would have wished for a longer period of McClanty at the helm, but it wasn't to be. And then, of course, Ramaphosa, with this remarkable CV, a man who's been in business, in trade unions, in government, and who has brought all of this many years of experience to bear. And he has the very difficult task of rebuilding confidence in the state, rebuilding state institutions, and trying to recover the economy, what he calls recovery, renewal, and rebuilding.
Let's jump forward to the Zuma years, Richard. Zuma succeeded Thabo Mbeki in 2009, but it was a big surprise, wasn't it? Because Mbeki had actually sacked Zuma as his deputy a few years earlier over corruption allegations.
Well, I was in Parliament the day that President Mbeki announced that he was going to dismiss his deputy president, Jacob Zuma. And I remember going to the press conference afterwards and then watching Zuma in the days and weeks that followed. And it's clear that you can trace so much of what has gone wrong back to that day. I'm not saying Mbeki was wrong, but what he did was to create a vicious enemy, politically speaking. And Zuma set out to revenge that political slight. And he rebuilt his political career. He created a coalition of the wounded. And at Polokwane in 2007, he won power at the ANC National Conference that year. And from that moment on, the die was cast, because what we then subsequently learned was that this was a man who was not a buffoon, who was not the ceremonial head of the organization in the country that many thought he would be. He went into power with a malign intent, and he attempted to steal the state. And for many years, all of the hard work, all of the blood that had been spilt in the 80s and 90s to win democracy, all of that was threatened by one man and his corrupt purpose. And around him, he created a group of yes people and people with venal intent who wanted to benefit from this corrupt project. And it took many years to defeat, but in the end, the rule of law in South Africa, the constitutional arrangements that had been negotiated, then brought into effect in the mid-90s, they held firm. The centre did hold. It was tight, and there were moments where one wondered if Zuma would be defeated, but he was defeated in 2018.
The nomination is in order. Accordingly, I declare the Honorable Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa duly elected President of the Republic of South Africa.
Ramaphosa took over. And Ramaphosa has had the very difficult task of rebuilding the state, rebuilding confidence in public ethics. And it's really a tough battle. It's like Sisyphus pushing that big stone up the hill. And it's going to take quite a long time, I think, to recover lost ground.
What would you say was Ramaphosa's immediate pressing task when he took over from Zuma in 2018?
Ramaphosa had to stem the tide. He had to put his finger in the bleeding, as it were, and triage. And he did that by putting in place processes that would lead to the dismissal of some of the chief architects and executioners of state capture. So the Revenue Service, the National Prosecuting Authority, Eskom, all of them within a year had new leadership, both in the executive and also in their boards. But what then Ramaphosa and people like Pravin Gordhan, who had been put in as Minister of Public Enterprises with a mandate to clean up the operations of these broken, corrupt and contaminated institutions, what they had then discovered was that the rot ran very deep and it infiltrated every kind of corridor and corner of these public bodies. And so winning back those democratic state enterprises for the public good was going to require a lot more than simply having the right leadership in place. It required root and branch overhaul and cleansing. And that is taking years to complete that process.
Yet Ramaphosa has been described as an ineffective leader. What's your view on that?
When I concluded my book on presidential leadership with the chapter on Ramaphosa, I really struggled to find the right balance here. I wanted to be fair to this leader. I wanted to put in context the extremely steep task that he had to confront. I wanted to take account of the fact that he inherited a broken state, that he had a difficult party at his back that is almost impossible to please because it's so deeply divided, and it itself has been contaminated with corrupt elements. I also needed to take into account the fact that he faced the unexpected onslaught of COVID-19, which did great harm, of course, to the economy and blasted a hole in the middle of his first administration. So taking all of these contextual factors into account, I wanted to be fair and balanced. I think he lacked strategic intent at times. I think he lacked sometimes courage and boldness in confronting strategic choices and having the awkward conversations and making the difficult decisions that leaders have to take. But taking a balanced view of how he's performed as president, I think he's done okay. I think he's put us back on track. I think we're pointing in the right direction now. But the rate of recovery is not quick enough because of his style and pace of leadership. And therefore, the country continues to suffer. And he is criticized for not being decisive enough as a leader.
Before we continue, we want to let you know about another podcast you might enjoy. Climate change affects everyone, but it doesn't affect everyone equally. Immigrants often bear a unique burden due to climate change, but they're also leading the way with impactful solutions. Feed in Two Worlds, the news outlet and journalism training organisation for immigrant voices, presents Home Interrupted. From flooded basement apartments in New York City to indigenous Maya farming practices in Nebraska, Feet in Two Worlds Home Interrupted brings you deeply reported original stories from across the United States. Episodes drop each week starting April 2nd. Find Feet in Two Worlds Home Interrupted wherever you listen to your podcasts. Okay, now back to the episode. So, Ramaphosa has been in power now for 6 years, Thabo, and he's seeking re-election in just a few weeks. He's trying to win what would be his second official term in office. What would you say is the mood right now ahead of the elections in South Africa, and how are the ANC expected to do?
South Africa is having its most contested national elections on 29 May. These will be contested by a record number of political parties, and we have independent candidates running for the first time. A running joke is that instead of a ballot paper, we have a ballot book. Also interesting is that Jacob Zuma is running against the ANC he used to lead under the banner of a new party called Umkhonto weSizwe. The most important thing about this election is that the ANC is widely expected to poll below the 50% needed to form a government on its own, and that we will have a national coalition government for the first time since democracy. So
there's a lot going on right now. This anniversary of 30 years of democracy and these elections, which are huge stakes. What's the mood?
I would say it's really one of high expectation. I mean, with so many political parties and people promising to save the country. I think it's quite interesting that we're celebrating 30 years of democracy. And then just over a month later, it will be supposedly the most important election since 1994. I mean, so a moment of great expectation.
What are people feeling about Mandela's legacy and the choices that he made at this moment?
That's what I wanted to find out. So I reached out to Sithembile Mbete, a lecturer in the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria. Sithembile's research focuses on the intricate political transformations from the Mandela era up to the present-day South Africa.
I was born right as all the big events that were leading to the end of apartheid were starting to happen just after the rates boycotts had started there, and the boycotts that led to the 1985 state of emergency. So I was born in a place that was burning. We lived in Sebokeng from 1984 to 1990. And so a lot of my early memories is of soldiers and police everywhere, of a lot of protests against the system, a lot of people dying and a lot of rallies and people on the streets for funerals. We moved from Sebokeng to an area called Spruitview in 1990, which was where so much of the violence was happening around the transition. And so those memories also are about just the fear, the violence, burning, soldiers, police, and just this real anxiety and tension.
Sebokeng was the site of the Sebokeng massacre, where people were killed, and I had to cover the inquest for quite a long time. It was really... And Spruitview is an area called the East Rand of Johannesburg. It's to the east of Johannesburg, about 30 kilometers or so. And I remember the violence there quite vividly. My wife and I had to flee Nikata Impi to attackers, and not very good memories. Then how do you see the progress that the country has made in terms of reconciliation and social cohesion since the end of apartheid?
Our class mobility was really improved by 1994, and our parents and we had access to opportunities that we otherwise wouldn't have had. We could move to the suburbs and take holidays and do all of those things that come with a middle class or an upper middle class lifestyle. Generalizing then, I suppose, from that experience to the general story of reconciliation in South Africa, I think that it's been limited by the lack of sort of generalized economic progress for the vast majority of South Africans. People say corruption started in 1994. Or the economy was thriving. Government's almost out of money now. South Africa was never broke before. And actually, firstly, there were 3 loan defaults by the South African government in the 1980s. And in 1994, the government was broke. And a whole lot of what was done between 1994 and 2001 was to pay off apartheid-era loans. I'm not sure that we should have actually done that, but this has placed serious limitations on what is possible in terms of reconciliation and social cohesion since apartheid ended.
How do you perceive Nelson Mandela's legacy resonating with young people, and what significance does he hold in contemporary South African society, would you say?
I think that there's a revision or a review of Nelson Mandela's legacy, mainly just from a dissatisfaction with the present and seeing the persistence of inequality, of all sorts of manifestations of kind of white supremacy and racism, and then all of the big political issues that we have, that for young people, and certainly many of the young people that I've taught, they just don't understand how the promise of South Africa, or what we keep saying around like how terrible apartheid was and then how good it was that we got a democracy, that this is all it is. I think there's this grappling of the new generation trying to understand why South Africa still looks the way that it does. And I don't think that enough has been done to talk about and to see Nelson Mandela as a person and as a politician and as a freedom fighter, not just as this icon that has created this kind of saint-like figure that can't be questioned, that can't be criticized. And you've seen then a backlash to that amongst young people who are like, why can't we criticize him? Why can't we criticize the decisions that were made? There's a lot of fault in the way that we teach our history in this country that has led to the misconceptions, the mis and disinformation that you see around Nelson Mandela as a figure, and also around the transition period and the kinds of decisions that were actually being made. And I think that over time, 30 years isn't a long time. I think that over time, I'm hoping that there'll be a much fuller story told of Nelson Mandela and what the limitations were of him and of the ANC, and what the contingencies of that 1990 to 1994 moment actually were.
I'm not as critical as other people of the transition. I don't think Mandela sold out. It was a negotiated settlement. We must think about the transition period the same way we think about any other post-conflict transition in what they deal with. The biggest concern is really just to stop the active violence and conflict and to create some kind of political basis for the future.
There was a lot that wasn't in the scope of the discussion. And indeed, when you see some of the early economic documents, if you read the original Reconstruction and Development Plan, which was the ANC's first economic policy document, there's some really radical, transformative stuff in there that was really supposed to transform the underlying structure of the South African economy and the society, and dealing with things like spatial segregation and decentralizing the economy. I think that Nelson Mandela was the right leader for the time. I think that South Africa's story would have ended a lot worse had it not been for him. And I think that he took the country through a really critical moment.
And so I think that our expectations of what could have been done in the past are too high. But then our expectations of what we should be reimagining in the present for the future are too low.
So, Thabo, I think from outside of South Africa, people might be really surprised to hear what Sithembile is saying here, that Mandela's legacy is really contested, and that many young people today are very critical of what he did and the choices that he made, because he's such a heroic political figure in a global context, this fight against apartheid. But not to everyone in South Africa, it seems. And a lot of that stems from what's happened since 1994, as she says.
Yes, it's true. I mean, Mandela's legacy is contested hugely. I hear what Sithembile is saying, but in my view, we could have achieved a lot more success in the past 30 years if we had the right people in key positions and no corruption. We need to learn from our mistakes and make a success of the next 30 years.
And what about the ANC itself then? This is a liberation movement that's continued to lead South Africa for 30 years, 3 decades, which is a really almost unprecedented amount of time for any political party to lead any country. What state is it in right now as an organization?
Well, the ANC, I mean, despite its continued dominance of South African politics, it's at a point where it's losing support. And also, I would say quite concerned, or should be concerned, about its continued relevance in South African politics. It's usually said that liberation movements have a lifespan of about 30 years. And it remains to be seen whether it can be an exception to what is the rule.
The ANC sees itself as a hegemonic institution, as necessarily hegemonic. That the only way to counter apartheid was to bring all Black people across class or across language into a single force that would be big enough to effectively counter apartheid and sort of the coalition of white South Africans that have entrenched colonialism and apartheid in South Africa. And so the ANC necessarily sees itself as the leader of society and as this all-encompassing entity. But what has happened to the ANC since 1994 is the same thing that happens to all liberation movements, but also to all dominant parties, which is that the people that join the party, once it has taken power, are joining the party for very different reasons than the people that were joining it when it was a struggle or a liberation movement, right? And they're now joining it for far more explicitly for power, and I think increasingly for economic interest. For a whole generation of young people, the ANC is synonymous with bad governance, with corruption, just off the politicians that they see every day. And these politicians that just don't seem to care about people except at election time. And when you delve into it and you look a bit more, it's not an inevitability. There's people there who are making sure that the state doesn't function so that they can extract rents from it. What I will say about the ANC is that as critical as people are of it, and as many failures as we've seen from the ANC in just running the country, the ANC is still the only political party that has a branch in every ward of the country. The ANC is the only political party that can put up party agents to monitor every single one of those voting stations, because it is the only political party that has created the organizational machinery to be present. And South Africa is a big country. It's a massive country. And I think that's an indictment on opposition politicians, particularly those parties that have existed for a very long time and that have had access to resources. And here I'm looking specifically about the Democratic Alliance. There was a moment where the DA could have become a kind of relatively broad church, been able to mobilize a broad enough swathe of the population to be able to be an actual challenger of the ANC. And they just never invested in it. And it's mind-boggling to me that they just haven't done that. The ANC remains in power because when it matters, it's the political actor that's there. And I think, and part of South Africa's future is going to rely on transcending the ANC. But that is not going to come from the ANC. It needs to come from political actors that can actually mount a challenge to the ANC, an effective one, and that can create a different vision for what the country will look like in future, and that can inspire the confidence of the majority of people. And that's hard work.
Looking to the future, what do you see as the challenges and say prospects for South Africa for the next 30 years?
We're still so tied in many ways to the miracle. And I think you've seen it so much in the election manifestos that have been released in the last couple of weeks, where very few parties are offering a different vision for the country. It's all, we want to go back to the glory days, to what the country was like before state capture or before Jacob Zuma or whatever it is. But it's still such a backward-looking vision. What should it look like going forward? You know, how should our education be organized? How should the state be organized? How should kids be getting to school? We know, what should our transport look like? There's no real vision for what a different South Africa could be.
South Africa's current biggest challenge is unemployment. We have a country and an economy that is not creating enough opportunity for young people to make a life. And there's always the stuff that's talked about with how so many people are on grants, and even the social relief of distress grant, the 350 Rand, which is a pittance, but there's so many people who are on it and who rely on it. And it's a function of unemployment and lack of opportunity. And we need to fix that to have a future. So I think that our biggest challenge is going to be about that, about actually reimagining things while dealing with climate change and the effects of climate change and the risks of geopolitical instability and possible war, global war, and dealing with all the social ills that we have around, like severe mental health issues, incredible violence and crime. And these are all polycrises that need to be fixed. But I also think there's a great opportunity to reimagine South Africa properly. I think that South Africa's greatest asset is its people. Yeah, so I remain hopeful that we'll do that at some point. And not me, people 20 years younger than me. And that really excites me.
What role do you see young people play in helping address the challenges in the country and shaping its future?
I think that young people currently aren't playing enough of a role in shaping the country presently and in shaping what the future is going to be of the country and how it's going to look. Our young people are asking very serious questions about the way that South Africa is structured, what we continued with around how we are set up as a state, how the government works, what the relationship is between the state and capital, are no longer fit for purpose. And I think that there's a lot of those debates that we should be bringing in. We've really, certainly in the last 10, 15 years, neglected young people and really actively including young people in governance, in even civil society conversations about the future of the country. And the 70% youth unemployment that we have, I think, is reflected also in how little inclusion there is of young people in these big debates about the future of the country and its present. The biggest influence I think the youth is having is in our cultural landscape. So music, dance, film, and theatre. And you can see how that is playing a role. Amapiano is like South Africa's biggest export at the moment. And I don't say this to be flippant. I think it's a really important thing that we've really neglected the contribution that young people should be making to not just our cultural life, but also our political, policy, economic life as a country.
It's good to hear, Thabo, Sithimbele's perspective here and her optimism, because South Africa has come a really long way since the end of apartheid, as we've heard over this series. And there is a lot to be proud of, as I'm sure you'll agree.
You are right. It's important to acknowledge our achievements as a nation. We do have problems, but there's a lot of good which has happened in the past 30 years. Thinking about the Zuma years, despite all the political turmoil, our judiciary remained a beacon of hope and made sure that we didn't slip further downhill. And also, civil society and the media have played a significant role in holding those in power accountable.
So are you optimistic, Thabo, about the future?
Oh, of course I am. Maybe because I don't have much of a choice. This is our country, and most of us have nowhere else to go. It must just work.
Well, thank you very much for taking us on this journey over the past 30 years of South African history. It's been wonderful having you on and hearing the conversations you've been having with these political experts. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Gemma.
That's it for this final part of our series, What Happened to Nelson Mandela's South Africa. You can go to theconversation.com to find a package of articles that Thabo and his team have been running about this momentous anniversary for South Africa. We'll put a link to where you can find those in our show notes. This series would not have been possible without our colleagues at The Conversation Africa, Gary Oberholzer, Jabulani Sikakani, Caroline Southey, and Moina Spooner. This series was written and produced by Mend Marawani, with assistance from our producer, Katie Flood. I'm the show's executive producer. Sound design is by Eloise Stevens, and our theme music is by Nita Sal. Stephen Kahn is our global executive editor, and Alice Mason runs our social media. You can find us on Instagram at theconversation.com or email us podcast@theconversation.com. If you like what we do, please support our podcast and The Conversation more broadly by going to donate.theconversation.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back with a regular episode of The Conversation Weekly next Thursday.